Hi there, thank you so much for joining me today. Today's video is the first of its kind that I've ever done, but I have seen a ton of videos like this coming out recently. I am going to be taking a palette that has recently been released, and I'm going to be trying to replicate as many of the shades as I can using stuff I already have in my collection. I've seen a ton of people do videos like this and I love them. I think they are so useful. I know Lauren May Beauty does it. I've been watching a lot of videos from Chic Geek who does it a lot. She does a lot of like really popular palettes. I think I just saw her do one for a Natasha Denona palette. Any other YouTubers who do examples like this, I'll try to have some of their videos linked in the description box as well, because I think it is a very helpful video idea. The palette I'm going to be trying to dupe with my collection is the Shroud Cosmetics Arcana palette. Shroud Cosmetics used to be called Strobe Cosmetics, and I do have a palette from them, the Creepy Cute palette, and I really like it. They mostly focus on eyeshadows. They might have a couple other products as well, but they are known for their good packaging and them being a more indie brand that is also cruelty-free. Their newest palette launch is called Arcana, and it is gorgeous. I'm loving that color scheme. It screams fall to me. It's got some pops of blues and greens, some really rich burgundies, and some other shades that I find to be very unique. There are even one or two that I haven't been able to fully dupe within my collection. I'm not duping this palette because I'm saying that you shouldn't buy it. If for some reason you do not want to buy that palette right now, but you'd like to create some looks inspired by the color story, then maybe you have some shades in your collection already to recreate it. This is a gorgeous palette. It's a brand that I would love to support. Currently the palette is on pre-sale for $47, and because I recently have purchased quite a few palettes, I do not feel comfortable bringing any more eyeshadows into my collection at this time. I think there is very much an art form in creating color stories that are inspiring or unique in some way, and I don't mean to discount the creativity that goes into creating something like this. I'm not saying you shouldn't support this brand. If you want this palette, by all means get it. But I just thought it'd be fun to try and see if I could recreate some of these color combos with something I already own. So let's get started. And I will have pictures comparing the swatches from the website to swatches from my shades. I do have quite a few singles that I wanted to talk about that I think are potential dupes, but I also have some shades from palettes in my collection that I think are dupes as well, so hopefully we can recreate the entire palette using just shades in my collection. In the swatches from the website, they have 2 shades on 2 fingers side by side, broken up into 6 different sections. So there are 12 shades in the palette, and I'm going to talk about them 2 at a time. So let's start with the first 2 shades from the palette. They are Sacred and Familiar. On the website, Sacred is categorized as a rusty red matte, and Familiar is described as a velvety rose gold brown metallic shimmer. But I think the closest shade that I have similar to that in my collection is from the Modern Renaissance palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills. The shade Red Ochre, I think, is very, very similar to the swatch on the website. If you don't have the Modern Renaissance palette, another shade that I think is very similar is from the Bold Obsessions palette from Milani. This shade right here up top, this is Red Between the Lines. I think this is also very similar. It does have a slight satin sheen to it, but it is something that you could definitely put in the crease, and I don't think it's going to look too stark. If you're looking for a matte shade, I don't think that this is going to be too far off. And I do have one more shade that I wanted to mention that would match that Sacred shade. It's from the Dose of Colors Friendcation palette, and I think it's in the shade Girl Bye. It's this middle shade right here. It's a really pretty burgundy red matte color. I think if you don't have Red Ochre or that shade from the Bold Obsessions palette, I think that this is incredibly similar as well. And I will give you a side-by-side swatch of Red Ochre from Anastasia Beverly Hills and Girl Bye. As for that next shade, Familiar, I have 3 shades that I think are similar, but not exactly. I think the 3 shades that I have lean a little bit more pink than they do rose gold brown. Part of me thought that Starry Eyed from Makeup Geek would be very similar because in the pan it looks almost exactly the same, but whenever you swatch it, this is way lighter. It is way more of a stark, bright shade than Familiar is. The other 2 shades I have to compare are a little bit more pink. The first one is Burnout from the Urban Decay Naked 3 palette. I think this one is similar in the level of depth, and it does have a slight pink undertone, but I don't think that the reflect is the same. I think the reflect from Burnout is not as bright and it's not as shimmery as Familiar is. And the third shade I have, which I think is the closest comparison, is from the Smashbox and Vlada palette, the Petal Metal eyeshadow palette. and the shade is called Floral Support. So it's this one right here in the middle. I think that one is the closest to it. It's just a little bit more pink than Familiar. The next duo is actually the one that inspired the idea for this video. It's the one that made me feel like I could recreate this palette with my own singles, and that is Shroud and Alchemy. So Shroud is described as a deep, slightly muted blue-gray matte, and Alchemy is described as a deep, jewel-toned green metallic with a slight teal shift. And I think I have two shades from Clionadh Cosmetics that I think are very similar. The blue, I would say, is very similar to Bookworm by Clionadh Cosmetics. On the website, when you go to purchase this, I think it looks a little bit more green in the photos than it does in real life. I think it's definitely more of a blue teal matte than a green. And the green, I would say, is a dupe, is also from Clionadh. It's a shimmer shade called Morgana. And I think those together, while maybe not as rich as the swatches look on the Shroud Cosmetics website, I would say that they're close enough that I think you could create a very similar look using those two shades. The next duo we're looking at are Chalice and Entity. Chalice is a super metallic antique gold, while Entity is a muted grungy mustard matte. So for Chalice, I do have, once again, another Clionadh Cosmetics single. It's actually a very new one to my collection, and it's the shade Rune. I think in the picture that I have provided, you're not able to pick up on the yellow gold shift as much. I think it is very, very similar. Maybe Chalice from Shroud Cosmetics has more of a yellow reflect than this one does, but I think it's incredibly similar. And the other olive green that I think is similar enough but not exactly the same is from the Dose of Colors Friendcation palette, and it's the shade Dirty Money, which is that olive shimmery shade right there. I think Dirty Money pulls less bright green and more of like an olive brown, but it does have that really bright yellow gold shift to it, which is really pretty. And in my opinion, I think the shade Paper Tiger by Colourpop is very similar to Entity. It's kind of like that burnt mustard grungy yellow shade. The next duo is more cool toned. It is Nocturnal, which is a deep purple taupe brown metallic, and Relic, which is a medium cool taupe brown matte. For Nocturnal, I have two ideas. The first one is from the Urban Decay Born to Run palette, and it's the shade Drift, which is this bottom shade right here. It is a charcoal gray. It does have like a slight purpley, like a really deep purple base to it, so I think that's what would make it similar to Nocturnal. And also Goodie Two Shoes from Colourpop I think is very similar as well. It still has that really deep purple base to it, but it is a very rich charcoal shade. Relic was a little bit more difficult. For that one, I'd have to mix a couple shades in order to get the same color. At first, I thought Nooner from the Urban Decay Naked 3 palette would be very similar because it does have a very cool toned look to it, and I think compared to all the other shadows and being in pink packaging, this looks a lot more gray in the palette than it does whenever you swatch it. However, if you have the Sultry palette, there are two shades in here that I think if you mix them together get you a little bit closer to that shade. If you mix Twig, which is a really cool toned medium brown, and Slate, which is a very cool toned true gray, I think mixing them together, which is the next shade over in my picture, I think that gets you a little bit closer. However, if you really want to get as close as you can to that shade from the swatch online, I think if you were to mix those three shades, Nooner, Twig, and Slate, if you were to mix them all together, I think that would bring you incredibly close to what Relic looks like. Definitely a lot more work. For some people, probably not worth it. But if you have those shades available to you, that's just something I would like you to know. This next duo, Alter, which is a muted burnt orange matte, and Enchantress, which is the perfect jewel-toned maroon red metallic. I think that duo will be the easiest to recreate in your palettes because warm palettes have been all the rage for quite some time now. So let's start with Alter. In order to keep it truly orange, I would say the closest match I have is actually from the e.l.f. Modern Metals palette. And these shades aren't individually named, but it's this orangey shade right here closer to the middle. I think this one would be the closest match, so if you have this palette, I think that those are almost exact dupes. If you don't have that palette, but you have this Anastasia Beverly Hills single in the shade Morocco, I think that this is also very, very close. Maybe a little bit lighter, but I still think it would give you the overall same effect. And lastly, if you have the Milani Most Loved Mattes palette, the shade Hiking in Sedona, which is this really orangey matte shade right here, second from the bottom. I think this is also incredibly close. This one is a little bit deeper and maybe just a hint more red orange than true orange. but I still think it's very similar. As for the burgundies, I think I have some shades that I would say are pretty spot on. The first one I want to talk about is from the Colored Raine Queen of Hearts palette, and it's one of my favorite shades in the palette. It's the shade Noblewoman. It's this really pretty bright burgundy shade. The reason I think that this matches more closely than the other ones is because there's something in the shift that's just slightly more like pinky red burgundy than the other ones, and I think that matches much more closely with what they were going for in the Arcana palette. If you don't have that, there's also a single from Tarte in the shade Revel. This is very similar. Maybe it doesn't have as much of like a pinky red reflect, but I still think it's incredibly similar. And the very last one is once again from the Dose of Colors Friendcation palette, and it's this corner shade right here. I think that's called Game Over. This one I think is the most dissimilar compared to the other two, but it is very metallic and bright. It probably doesn't come off as deep as the other two does, but I think it's just because the reflect is a little bit brighter. And the last duo is the two shades that I feel the least confident about perfectly duping from my collection, just because those seem like very unique shades, and even when I was looking online, it doesn't seem like Makeup Geek or Colourpop or Nabla. It doesn't seem like a lot of companies that sell single shadows have those types of shades that are as deep as that green from Darkling or as bright as Mystic. Darkling is described as a deep, dark, muted green. Mystic is a gorgeous, deep, metallic cobalt blue. Those are a little bit more difficult to find, even when you type in like cobalt blue shimmer single. It doesn't seem like a lot come up. It might be easier to find a matte version of that. I think shimmer is a little bit more difficult to find. Even so, I think from my own collection, if I wanted to create something with those colors, I would most likely use Team Captain from Colourpop, which is a really pretty matte kind of khaki. It's not as dark as Darling, and I think the undertone isn't as deep forest green. It probably airs more olive than anything. And for the blue, I don't feel as confident about this one because even though in the photo it looks like it'd be pretty similar, I think when you look at it in real life, it's not. And it's this blue shade from the Friendcation palette from Dose of Colors. I think it's called A Moment. And this one is more of a duochrome. It's blue in some lights and purple in others, and it has a very dark, almost blackened base. And so I don't think it's similar pretty much at all to Mystic. But I think if you're going for like a rough, inspired by type of look, and you have this palette, that shade is as close as you might get. If anyone knows of some shade dupes for those two shades, I would be very grateful. Maybe I can put them in the description box for people to look at in the future. All in all, I think I did pretty well at matching what I have in my collection to what is in the palette. This was my first time ever doing something like this, so if there is a better way for me to compare the shades or make it a little bit easier and more succinct, please let me know. Let me know if there's anyone that does these types of videos that you don't think I know about. I would love to go and check out their channels. If there are any other palettes out there that you think I might be able to dupe with the palettes that I have in my collection, please let me know. Maybe I can do a couple more videos like this. But in the meantime, that's everything I have. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys.